Welcome, everyone. My name is Yunus Sangyabadi. I am the Executive Vice President of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Today, I'm honored to introduce our distinguished experts joining us to discuss the prospects for Iran-GCC rapprochement in the Biden era. Before I introduce our panelists and our great moderator, let me say a few words about our institute. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD, is a Canadian nonprofit and nonpartisan foreign policy think tank dedicated to promoting sustainable peace through diplomacy, dialogue, and constructive engagement. Dialogue is not easy, especially when we are talking about a complex region such as the Persian Gulf. As an institute dedicated to the cause of peace, our objective with panel discussions we host, like the one today, is to bring together experts with diverse and opposing views to discuss and debate complicated foreign policy issues of our time. We strongly believe that through these debates and discussions, we can develop a more comprehensive understanding of each side's concerns and help our policymakers adopt a more creative and open-minded approach in managing the strategic challenges of the 21st century. Now, let me introduce our panel of experts. Hossein Mousavian is a Middle East Security and Nuclear Policy Specialist at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. He is a former diplomat who served as Iran's ambassador to Germany from 1990 to 1997. From 1997 to 2005, he was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee of Iran's National Security Council. From 2003 to 2005, he served as the spokesperson for Iran in its nuclear negotiations with the European Union. He is the author of the Iranian Nuclear Crisis, a memoir published by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 2012. His latest book, A New Structure for Security, Peace, and Cooperation in the Persian Gulf, was published by Rowman Littlefield in 2020. Ilan Goldenberg is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. He is a foreign policy and defense expert with extensive government experience covering Iran's nuclear program, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the broader challenges facing the Middle East. Goldenberg served as the Chief of Staff to Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations at the U.S. Department of State. From 2009 to 2012, he served first as Special Advisor on the Middle East and then as the Iran Team Chief in the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Ebtesam Al-Ketbi is the founder and president of the Emirates Policy Center and the first Arab woman to lead a think tank. She is a professor of political science at United Arab Emirates University and a member of the Consultative Commission of the Gulf Cooperation Council. She is also a member of the board of directors at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Abdullah Baabood is the former director of the Center for Gulf Studies in Qatar University. He is an Omani academic focusing on economic, social, and political development in GCC states and their foreign policies. He is currently a visiting research professor at the National University of Singapore's Middle East Institute. Mr. Baabood has published several books and articles and has taught at various European institutions and universities. Barbara Slavin is the director of the Future of Iran Initiative and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. She is also a lecturer in international affairs at George Washington University and a columnist for Al-Monitor. Slavin is the author of Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, Iran, the US, and the Twisted Path to Confrontation. She is a regular commentator on US foreign policy and Iran on NPR, PBS, and C-SPAN. With that, I'll hand the floor over to Barbara. Thank you very much for accepting to moderate this timely panel. The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Yunus. It's a pleasure, and it is indeed an extremely timely panel. For those of us in Washington, the advent of the Biden administration is a shot in the arm for diplomacy, not just for COVID vaccination. And there's a lot of diplomatic work to do, obviously, including salvaging the Iran nuclear deal. But beyond that, I think everyone acknowledges that the JCPOA although it did seek to deal with the nuclear issue, did not really deal with the tensions in the region that we have seen get worse really over the course of the Trump administration. So I think it's important that we deal with these issues now, that we try to look at what can be done under the Biden administration to reduce tensions in the region, because frankly, the region cannot afford these conflicts anymore. And we have seen that with the decrease in the price of oil, with the budget problems all the countries are facing, and of course with the COVID pandemic. So we have a great group of speakers, and we only have an hour, and I don't want to take any more of your time, so let's get right to it. I'm going to start with Ambassador Mousavian, who is a veteran of efforts to bridge the Iran-Saudi divide, and wrote a really excellent op-ed in The Guardian last month with the Saudi intellectual Abdulaziz Sagar that outlined both the problem and I think a possible way forward. So Hossein, let me start with you. If you could briefly give us your ideas about how to resolve these tensions.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Eunice, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending in the US, Canada, or Asia, or elsewhere. I would try to be very brief. Barbara, I think the first reality is that the Persian Gulf region suffers from three conflicts. One is Iran-GCC conflict. Second is Iraq-GCC conflict. Iraq invaded Kuwait, we all remember. And the third is GCC conflict. We all remember Qatar issue and Saudi UAE problem with Qatar. Therefore, we need a solution in order to address all these conflicts. The second reality is that we have at least 8 mutual negative realities. One is mistrust is mutual, mutual threat perception, mutual misunderstanding, mutual grievances, mutual blames, mutual accusations, mutual hostilities, mutual misperceptions, and mutual mistakes. We all have made a mistake. On the way forward, we have two options, confrontation or cooperation. We have already experienced confrontation for years or decades. We can continue the animosity. This definitely would be a policy of lose-lose for everyone. And at the end, we are going to have a failed region. Or we can choose peace and cooperation. For peace and cooperation, it requires, first of all, for all parties to stop blame game. We have been living for 40 years in blame game. As long as we are going to continue, we cannot think about solution. Second, to understand the mistrust and the threat perception of each other, whether this is real or imagined. We have to recognize and we have to understand every party has a real threat perception. And then to start to talk to each other instead of about each other, at each other. I believe for talks, dialogue, we would need both a bilateral talks and a multilateral, because it's not going to resolve the problem only through bilateral or only through multilateral. For multilateral, we need to create a forum of dialogue between all 8 countries around the Persian Gulf. And then we need to start to begin with confidence building measures, even if this is small, from small to big, from Corona to Yemen, from Corona to other issues. And then we have to restore diplomatic relations, because without diplomatic relations, we are not going to get to anywhere. And the most important, I believe, in this period is to agree on the end state with a roadmap. I suggest, I have been working for a decade, that the end state for 8 countries should be a new security and cooperation system among all countries based on the following principles: mutual respect, mutual interest, equal footing, sovereignty, integrity, inviolability of the international borders, non-interference, rejecting the threat or use of force, rejecting sectarianism, respecting the Vienna Convention about the immunity of diplomatic facilities, diplomats, and so, cooperation on counterterrorism collectively, rejecting hegemony by any country, whether this is Iraq or Iran or Saudi Arabia or a world power. No one should have hegemony. Everyone should have an equal footing, position, and situation. Ensuring freedom of navigation and free flow of oil and energy. And finally, we should decide on a nuclear and WMD-free zone in the Persian Gulf. This is the 13 principles I have in mind. And then we would need a roadmap, which the roadmap should come from dialogue. I try to stop in my 5 minutes, Barbara.
That was very efficient. Let me just ask one follow-up, because the United States, as we all know, has, I think, still about 50,000 troops in this region. What role do you foresee for the United States, and particularly for the US military, going forward? Because, of course, Iran has consistently demanded that US withdraw its forces.
I believe sooner or later the US would withdraw. Maybe not now, maybe after 5 years, maybe after 10 years. That's why the vacuum of the US forces and US presence should be filled correctly and properly. We have resolution, Barbara 598, has given a mandate to Secretary General to start a dialogue with 8 countries for a security system. If this resolution is old, the P5, they can have a new resolution. They can have it in 24 hours to give a mandate to the Secretary General to start. I believe our friends, our neighbors, they are afraid if there is any agreement, who or which body would be the guarantor. I have been discussing with many friends at GCC. They say, even if we agree, we cannot trust you. And they may say the same to Saudi Arabia. They may say the smaller countries to Iraq, That's why they are looking for a guarantor. I believe since the UN Security Council is the highest level of the highest body for maintaining security and peace, if they give mandate to Secretary General, they could be a guarantor through a resolution. If we come to a final agreement, this could become a resolution. And then the US definitely is member of United Nations Security Council, and they can have a role through a multilateral approach.
Ebtesam, let me turn to you. I'd like your reaction to what Hossein has put forward, how you think the United Arab Emirates is going to handle what is definitely a different mood in Washington now when it comes to Iran, when it comes to the region. The Emirates has always been very flexible and very forward-leaning. Do you think that they're going to be able to work with the Biden administration to decrease tensions with Iran?
First of all, thank you, Barbara, and I'm so honored to see also my old friends with me in this panel. If I would say something that I wish people in Tehran have the same discourse of Mousavian. Now, despite the contradictory stance by the two sides, Arab and Iran's, the development shows, as Mousavian indicate, that an increasing calls for dialogue on both sides now, especially in the light of the sense of declining power on both sides as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, the decline of oil prices, the depletion of financial surplus as a result of regional conflicts, and the inability of all sides to achieve any decisive military victory in this conflict. Now, the Emirati side views Iran on the basis of that there is a manageable geopolitical competition between the two sides, despite the dispute between the UAE and Iran over the 3 occupied islands and other issues. The UAE does not see Iran as an existential threat and not resort to militarize the issue of the island. Developments show an Emirati desire to open the door for dialogue with Iran. The outstanding issues between Iran and the Arab Gulf countries can be divided into disputed issues, which is Iran regional activities and its missiles program, as well as the other 2 issues that express common interests in principle, despite differences in strategies and implementation: the security of the Gulf region and the maritime navigation and regional economic cooperation. Now, I would say if there will be a dialogue, GCC countries should seek to internationalize the anticipated dialogue, as any regional negotiation should be held under international auspices. As Mousavian mentioned, that why? Because they fear that, and they have also that experience, that Iran does not stick to its promises. So that's why the need for the guarantor. So the idea of regional dialogue under international supervisions on 2 controversial issues: Iran regional activities and its missile program, in addition to the other 2 issues of common interest: the security of the Gulf region and maritime shipping and regional economic cooperation. This proposal called for keeping Iran's nuclear program within its previous international track, represented by the 2015 nuclear deal. This proposal builds on the success achieved by the American maximum pressure campaign without overlooking Iran's resilience and take into consideration new regional and international developments, especially challenges posed by the coronavirus pandemic and the decline of oil prices. Now, the regional dialogue presents a suitable exit for all parties. It provides Tehran and Washington with an honorable alternative instead of constant escalation, which seems tiresome for both sides at the time of fear of a global economic recession and international efforts to come out of the economic fallout of the coronavirus pandemic. Such a dialogue would also provide Tehran with an opportunity for economic recovery after harsh years of economic pressure. Arabs who were affected by Iran's attempt for hegemony see the regional dialogue as a way out of escalation and an alternative to bilateral dialogue, in which Tehran has the upper hand. In addition, this dialogue lacks any guarantees of Iran commitment to the outcome of such dialogue. So the regional dialogue would also be an alternative to the international dialogue with Iran that does not take Arab interests into consideration, despite the occasional contradictory stands by the 2 sides, Arab and Iran. Development shows an increase in calls for dialogue on both sides, especially in the light of sense of declining power on both sides. Barbara, there is a triangle in the Middle East, and there is this triangle between Iran, Israel, and Turkey, and none of them can control the region because of many reasons. Iran has the soft power, the ideology, but its military cannot control. Israel has the military capabilities, but hasn't got the soft power which can control the region. Turkey the same. So instead of this everybody has to realize that if we want to live together, and we are neighbors, so everybody has to abandon its dream with emperor controlling the region, and let's have that Abrahamic Accord, build on it, have a region with prosperity and economic cooperation. But we have to solve all these issues between us and Iran.
Thank you. Let me ask you the same question I asked Hossein. And what do you anticipate the U.S. role would be in this? How would the U.S. be able to facilitate this? What sort of guarantee do you think the U.S. should still provide, perhaps, for this kind of process?
Well, that when you have the, with all respect to UN, yes, it should be there, but U.S. is our allies, okay? So there will be that we sit on the table, we take all the issues which I mentioned, the 4 issues, not separating issues like Iran, what they are doing, okay? And then one also from the UN and US on that table where we are negotiation. So it will take time, of course. In each step that will we reach any agreement, that will be that guarantee, and we list that what we have reached, and that guarantor when we reach the comprehensive agreement, that at least Iran cannot say, no, I did not agree on that or not that, as it used to be. I know Hossein will mention the Hormuz initiative, but that Hormuz initiative hasn't got the guarantee, okay? That's why we need that international guarantee.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. Abdullah, I want to turn to you now from your perch in Oman. Obviously, Oman has been enormously helpful as a mediator and a go-between in conflicts between the Arabs and Iran. But I wanted you to bring us up to date on the situation next door in Yemen, where we have seen some major developments. The Biden administration has announced an end to offensive support for offensive Saudi operations in Yemen. It has taken away the attempt to designate the Houthis as terrorists because of the humanitarian situation there. How ripe is this conflict now for some kind of resolution? I mean, Yemen is a very complicated place. We all know that there are many, many factions there. So do your best in 5 minutes. And you're muted, so there you go.
Thank you, Barbara, and also echo my colleagues and thank Yunus for the kind invitation. Well, I think to begin with, the conflict in Yemen is again a manifestation of the current situation of the Middle East. We have been seeing many crises in the Middle East, and I'll come to Yemen in a minute. But you know, the Middle East and the Gulf region has witnessed many wars and conflicts over the years. And because of this ongoing conflict between Iran on one side and the Arab side, these conflicts have exacerbated and not been resolved. Now, one cannot also just blame the whole crisis and the war in Yemen on the external influence or powers. Obviously, they have a role to play, but Yemen has always been, as you rightly mentioned, is a conflict area, and a country that has been at conflict with itself. You know, it was divided into North and South. It was it had its own civil wars. It has a dictatorship in a way, and you know, there was in the Arab Spring, the Yemeni people went out calling for democracy. The Gulf states interfered with the GCC initiative, and all of that. So, but I think Yemen also, because it's a soft spot and a soft belly, if you like, to Saudi Arabia, and also an area that has that's susceptible for influence from other countries, has seen a lot of interference from the outside. So we are talking about in domestic internal dynamic as by regional conflicts. Now, regional conflicts obviously have escalated this, and it's almost Yemen has become a ground for proxy war between the two sides of the Gulf. Now, with the current Biden administration, we are seeing a number of changes in the policies in the region. Yemen is one of them, but let me just go back and say, look, we've seen that there are movements. One of them is, of course, the reconciliation between the Gulf states, the GCC Rapprochement. And that's an indication that perhaps, there is some kind of a new approach to deal with the new administration. We've seen that also in Saudi Arabia, there is a lot of reform in terms of political prisoners, etc., releasing and sentencing some of them, which is I think are actually good news in a way. I think also Yemen is one of those areas that we will perhaps see some kind of a movement on that front. And given, of course, the Biden administration and his announcements before pre-election that he was going to stop supports and he was going to make Yemen stop the war in Yemen or help to stop the war in Yemen. I think these announcements are echoing, and of course the policies have now taken place, as you correctly mentioned. He's ended the military support to the Saudi and also rescinded or stopped the process of labeling the Houthis as a terrorist organization. I think at least the last one is helpful, because if we want to resolve the crisis in Yemen, you cannot negotiate with a group that is labeled as a terrorist organization, and that would have complicated the situation. So I think the Houthis, from my understanding, they are ready for negotiations. They want to talk. They understand that they cannot by themselves control the country. They also understand that that they cannot have an endless support from Iran or their allies. And they understand that they can only have, and that Yemen can only be peaceful if it has achieved internal peace if it's peaceful with its own neighbors. And they know that the money and the economic development, etc., is going to come from the Gulf states. So they are actually seeking that, and we're not in the at the point where we're saying who's right and who's wrong and who started the war and who did what. I think we should be, as the whole panel here is looking forward. Where do we go from there? And to go from there, we have to engage all the parties involved, Houthis included. And I think this announcement does actually help. And we're seeing that Martin Griffiths has also now made a visit to Saudi Arabia, and he followed that by a visit to Iran, which are, of course, the two major regional powers that are involved in this conflict. And I think there is going to be some movement, because the war in Yemen has been catastrophic for everybody. It's been catastrophic, especially for the Yemeni people. It's a humanitarian crisis that really needs to stop. And time has come, maybe under the Biden administration, with the pressure that he's putting on all sides to do that. And it may be one good start, if you like, or one good step towards reconciling other conflicts between the two sides of the Gulf. So, from this perspective, I am pleased to see that there is some development in Yemen. As you know, Yemen is a neighbor to us here in Oman, and we suffer a lot because of that, and we share their suffering, and we are accepting a lot of their wounded people and treating them. And we know how bad the situation is, because we are talking about family linkages, we're talking about tribal linkages, etc. So stopping the war in Yemen is, of course, going to be great news for everybody, for the Yemeni people, for us, and I think for the region. I think this could be a good start, where we could see Saudi Arabia in particular and Iran reconcile their differences. And I think Yemen could be the first most important step. And both sides should give in this front to ensure that we have a stable democratic and of course developed country, whether they want to stay united or not, that's their own decision. But I think we should all work towards easing the tension, stopping the war, and trying to help to rebuild the country. I don't know how much time have I got, but if you want me, I'll stop here.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. Let me turn now to Ilan, so we'll have time for questions from the audience. Ilan, I'm just curious your impression of the moves that the Biden administration has already taken. Of course, it's also named an envoy, special envoy for Yemen as well as for Iran. How do you see the Biden administration handling the region as it also proceeds to try to salvage the JCPOA?
Sure, and thank you, Barbara and Eunice, for having me, and great to join all of you. And so I think the first thing I'll say about the Biden administration is we're 2 weeks in to the middle of a global pandemic that they just inherited, and a government, frankly, that they're having to rebuild in many cases the bureaucracy. So I think it's going to take some time to see everything, and everybody's very eager to sort of see where it all goes. But I think one important just point of recommendation for all watchers is patience and give them a little bit of time. Our transitions involve, ultimately hundreds and a few thousand, people leaving and coming into the government. So it just doesn't happen snap overnight. If anything, I think they're off to one of the fastest starts you've seen from an administration, in recent history. But a lot of it is based on, the president's first two priorities, which were COVID and just rebuilding the U.S. economy in this environment. So I think patience is merited before we overinterpret every single move they make in their first 2 weeks. I do think what I've heard so far is I do think you will see a focus, especially early on, both the nuclear issue and on the region. I think in the Q&A box, I saw a question about sort of longer and stronger, which is one of the things the Biden administration keeps talking about when they talk about the nuclear agreement. I do think that what they say that, I don't think it means we're going to get some big grand agreement that has everything in the region and all the nuclear issues all in one. That's not what they're talking about. I think what they are talking about is first, or not even first, in parallel really, like an effort for either a mutual return to the JCPOA, or if that is not possible, something short of that, some sanctions, basically stopping the negative slide on the nuclear program in exchange for some sanctions relief, whatever that looks like. I think, and that'll take time right now. I mean, the opening positions, the Biden administration is saying Iran must go first. The Iranians are saying the Biden administration must go first. I think these are totally understandable given that the two sides haven't sat down and actually started having a conversation yet. But it's not just going to be about the nuclear issue. They are very much going to focus, I think, much more in the region. I think they've learned from the experience of the Obama administration, where you need to, from the beginning, put more focus on that. And there, I think a lot of what Ebtesam, Al-Ketbi, and also, Hossein Mousavian were saying, I think makes a lot of sense in terms of some kind of a regional dialogue that I think the U.S. government, it would have to be separate from the nuclear issue, because our partners have to be in that dialogue. It can't just be the P5+1 in Iran working it out. I think there's clarity that is a disaster that especially our friends in the region want to be involved in the issues that they care the most about, obviously. At the same time, the U.S. does need to be a player in this because of our role. And because as you heard, from Ebtesam, I don't think the Gulf wants to sit down by itself with Iran and just do this. But at the same time, it doesn't just need to be the US. It can be internationalized. It can be the P5+1, for example, which hopefully adds some reassurance to Iran that it's not just, the greatest ally of the Gulf states together with the Gulf states negotiating with Iran, but it's also other players who have a different perspective, such as Russia or China, who have, especially Russia, has played more of a supportive role of Iran in the nuclear talks and sort of a bit of a broker. So you have to broaden it. It needs to involve both multilateral issues, but also, I agree, bilateral. And I do think that you have to start somewhere. COVID is a good example of an issue we can start on. I think there is other areas where you can focus on de-escalation in the naval domain, maybe de-escalation in, I think, maybe starting with a return to pre-2019 in terms of de-escalation in the naval domain, and as well as, targeting Americans in Iraq, in exchange for part of the return, maybe even to the JCPOA would involve this de-escalation. I think you can focus on issues like non-interference, which requires mutual agreements from both sides. Neither side will necessarily admit to some of the things it does to the other, but I think that if you can have, and these are things that are hard to verify, but frankly, I think a lot of interference that happens, especially in the Gulf itself and the GCC states, is not all that valuable or strategically important to Iran. And to the extent that the GCC states are sometimes supporting various groups inside of Iran, that's not very valuable to the GCC states. None of these things are realistically going to overturn these governments. And so negotiating on stopping that and trying to find verifiable ways to reduce that is another idea. I also think, even as you do this, you can also look at Yemen. I think that's an important area to focus on early, but I wouldn't make it the centerpiece, only because that's going to be very, very hard. And I think you want to pursue some easier things while you're also doing Yemen. I mean, eventually it'd be wonderful to get to Syria also, but these are some of the hardest things. So, I think some of the easier areas might be more ripe for early discussion as well. And then I would also say that, at least from an American perspective, something that's important to pair this with is, strong US GCC ties, and also supporting, the Abraham Accords and making positive progress there. It doesn't have to be in the offensive categories of support, which is really what the withdrawal of US support for Yemen conflict was. But can, for example, the US and Israel and the GCC work together to counter challenges posed by, unmanned aerial, UASs, by, low-end rockets? It's not just about sort of the high-end sort of missile defense. It's all the rockets and stuff that's coming out of, places like Yemen that frankly has some, is a lot of it's coming originally from Iran, or at least with technological support from Iran. Those are the same challenges Israel faces from Hezbollah, and from Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And what Israel has found is, as it has become better at countering those things, it has had to do less to militarily intervene because it's able to protect its population. Like, can we learn from that and apply some of those lessons to the Gulf? So there's got to be both, and this goes back, generally, maybe I'll close with this. A lot of times when people talk about Gulf security architecture, they look at OSCE as the model, right? Sort of like Europe having this model. But Europe also had NATO at the same time. You needed a strong alliance, and then you were also able to reach out to the Soviet Union. And so for the US, I think this is an important lesson. You need to have good relationships with your partners and work together to go in the right directions, to defend themselves. But at the same time, you need to also have, an ability to talk with countries you have tensions with and use that to de-escalate at the same time. So, I hope that's what, a Biden administration pursues, but that's going to take place over a long period of time. The news in the next few weeks is going to be all about the nuclear issue, because that's what everybody focuses on first. But, I think the long play is addressing all these issues in ways that can ultimately de-escalate challenges for both sides.
Thank you very much. My own curiosity is, do you think the US is going to, that Biden will formally rescind or override the executive order quitting the JCPOA at some point in the next few weeks, even if the US doesn't engage in massive sanctions relief? And also there's news, I don't know if it's been verified, apparently, that the IMF loan of $5 billion that Iran has been seeking for COVID for some months now, that may finally go through, which looks like an obvious confidence building measure.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I read that the article on the IMF, the first story that came out, and then some of the follow-on stories seem to be less enthusiastic. At least it sounds like right now the IMF is at least moving to retest the proposition. It's unclear the American administration has come out with a position yet on that. I don't know if they will. I also don't know, what they might do in the executive order. I do think what's important to remember is, look, at the core of the sanctions relief are the questions of, Iranian oil sales and the funds that are foreign exchange reserves held up in other accounts. Like, those are the two most important things. And I think when the administration says it's not going to be making big steps on those until we also see Iran making steps on the nuclear issue. And I think that's going to be don't expect the American administration to lead with either of those two. But, if they find other ways to take confidence building measures to at least demonstrate, like, we're not the Trump administration, we do want to engage, without moving those two, I think, are part of going back into the JCPOA, which can be done mutually. It can be done step by step. I think there's all different sort of formulations for how you do that. It can be done while also starting a regional dialogue, although, I'm sure Hossein will tell us, and we've heard I've heard every Iranian official I've heard say, like, we are open to a regional dialogue after we're back on the nuclear issue, and the US demonstrates that it's actually following through on its commitments in the JCPOA. So I'm skeptical we're going to get too far on the nuclear issue until we have progress, or on the regional issue, until we have progress on the nuclear issue. Mm-hmm. Though I think there's a lot for the US to do with the Gulf states in the meantime, and with Israel, even if that engagement with Iran only comes later. So.
Thanks. We have a question from the audience that deals with the Israel question, and maybe I'll take this back to Hossein. And the question is whether you can have GCC-Iran reconciliation without resolving the conflict between Iran and Israel. So maybe I'll just rephrase that a little bit in terms of the impact of these Abraham Accords. Hossein, we could see Israel provide the Iron Dome system, for example, to Saudi Arabia, to the Emirates, to other countries that have faced attacks from these short-range and rockets, cruise missiles, and so on. How do you see Israel playing into this? And of course, we need to add that Israel is now part of Central Command formally, which is a reorganization that kind of symbolizes, I guess, the ability of the Israelis now to deal directly with Arab countries, more Arab countries. Hossein, you're muted still. You need to unmute.
Barbara, our experience in the last 78 years tells us any foreign intervention in this region has made the situation more complicated. No foreign power or regional power interfering in affair of this region could bring sustainable peace, security. Iran is definitely angry with the invitation of Israel to the Persian Gulf by our neighbors. But I think at the end, if we are going to agree on principles like mutual respect and sovereignty and non-interference, it is for the GCC countries, they decide about their relation with any other country. And it is for Iran to decide for its relation with any other country, whether this is Russia or Syria or China. And so we should concentrate, we should focus about our own region, our own destiny. I think rather than bringing such a defense systems from other countries, why 8 countries, they do not sit together to establish a joint military for security of the Persian Gulf and for security of each other? Why we should always stick to threatening each other by employing the other countries? I mean, we have tried this for decades, and we have never been able to bring peace, security, stability, and friendship. Therefore, I believe this is the time for those countries for a comprehensive. It takes time. It takes time. It's not going to happen in a night. But at the end, if we have a comprehensive relation in security, military, political, economic, then each country would be responsible for the security of the other country. Iran would consider the security of Saudi Arabia its own security, and vice versa. The security of Bahrain or Emirates, its own security. We would be able to have a joint, like Europeans, we would be able to have a joint military task force for every issue, like the security of the Persian Gulf, or if any country is attacked, the other countries, they should join to defend. We all remember when Kuwait was attacked, GCC was helpless, and they got help from the US. Why this region should buy trillions of dollars of most sophisticated arms, and if a country is attacked, they cannot do anything? Then for what? That's why I believe we should think about collective cooperations rather than investing or inviting or counting on any other regional or international powers.
Let me just ask you about Iran and Israel, though. I mean,
see, the reality is that Iran is not going to recognize Israel. That's it. And Iran is going to support Palestinians. And Iran is going to resist Israeli hegemonic or aggressive, whether attacking Syria or Iraq or Lebanon or so. But I believe the GCC, Iraq and Iran, they can and they should be able to separate their own issues about the bilateral relations each country has with the other countries. When we say sovereignty, when we say integrity, when we say non-interference, it means we should be able to implement all these principles practically, not just in words.
Ebtesam, let me come back to you. Iran's way of amassing influence in the region, as we have seen, is its ability to, shall I say, exploit, recognize grievances, particularly of minorities in various societies, whether they be Shia or Palestinian. These are very difficult issues to deal with. I mean, how do you may be able to prevent rockets from hitting targets, but how do you safeguard your population from this kind of Iranian influence? Even if Iran promises that it's not going to be sending weapons or trying to deliberately stir people up, still there is this issue, and this is something that Iran has always profited by. So I'm just curious your sense of how one deals with Iranian influence in Arab countries, particularly among Shia populations.
Well, Barbara, Iran sponsored the Shiite minority through a geopolitical project with a narrow-minded doctrinal character. Tehran has gradually abandoned the ambitions of the founding father of the Islamic revolution related to the leadership of the whole Islamic world as a part of what was known as the theory of al-Qura, literally the mother of all cities. After realizing that it is impossible to achieve this purpose. Now, contrary to Iran's official discourse, which is usually refers to the regime desire to adopt a cooperative strategy that aims to present common objective for all members of regional order, the actual behavior of the Iranian regime shows an excessive tendency towards unilateral imperial strategies, which are characterized by violence and intimidation. Look, what kind of model now? Look to Lebanon. Okay, Hossein is mentioning that Iran is protecting the Syrian, the Iraqi, the Lebanese from Israel. Okay, now look to the latest incidents, killing of Luqman Salim, a thinker, and yeah, look to Iraq is a failure state. Syria is a failure state. Lebanon is a failure state. Yemen is a failure state. All of those are, where is the proxies of Iran there? What kind of model Iran is giving for these countries instead of bloods and killing. And now regarding to Yemen, I want to comment on that, okay? With all respect, with Biden and the American, I think they lack the understanding of our region now. Just lifting that or designating the Houthi as a terrorist group now, abandoning this, doesn't make Houthi can come and sit on the table. Sending the drones to Saudi yesterday, attacking Ma'rib, and this is so, and the others, you tie their hand and they cannot respond, and you call them to stop the war. Okay, Saudi will stop the war today. UAE is not there anymore. But what is the guarantee that Houthi? Now, yesterday they sent their drone. What does the American they are going to do? Look to the humanitarian aid. Where does this go? Where does it go? The Houthi take it and give it to a supporter. Even doesn't give to the people in Saudi who does not support Houthi. So the Western allies needs to understand our region to first to please come and talk to us and put the issue and let us talk about it instead of taking your decision regarding our region without coming back to us. I think there is an opportunity for everybody in the region. With all respect, Hossein, we can go in that what you are calling that Iran is going to defend the GCC. Why we are putting those arsenal of arms? Why? Because of your ballistic missile, because of your nuclear capabilities. You are threatening us. We don't threaten you. We don't intervene in your countries. You are interfering in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. And that's why this mistrust between us, because of that. We have something in our hand to tell you this, 1, 2, 3 issues. We need to sit. But your people in Tehran, they don't have the same view you have it, Mousavian. No, they don't have it. I wish they have the same discourse and view you have it.
Yeah. Let me come to Abdullah for your thoughts on the fact that the Houthis are still sending rockets into Saudi Arabia, even after the Biden administration has made these gestures. I see the State Department has condemned the rocket attacks, but clearly does not seem like a very good response on the part of the Houthis. Is there anything that, I mean, I'm not saying this is an argument for the United States to continue to support the war, because the longer the war goes on, it seems the more successful the Houthis have been, frankly, in terms of taking territory and so on. But I'm just curious your response to that. What can be done to convince the Houthis to stop their attacks on the Saudis now?
Well, I think we have to understand that, that we are talking here about a rebellious group who took over power. And you know, they have their own ideology and they have their own way of doing things, and they are not necessarily that sophisticated in terms of, you know, international politics, etc. And they have been making mistakes, a lot of mistakes. Equally, I think everybody has made mistakes, and I think what the Houthis have done now, it's just a completely miscalculation at a time when, you know, the Biden administration is trying to push for more peaceful resolution to the conflict. And I think equally, I think everybody has been making mistakes. The war itself was a mistake. And you know, so many people have been killed. The crisis that the Yemeni people have endured is a grave mistake for everybody. You know, including all of us in the GCC, in the Gulf and beyond. Even the United States supported the war, and so I don't think we should go back now, despite the fact this is more recent. We should go back now to the history. Of course, we cannot forget history, And I can see that the conversation is again descending to that misperception and mistrust that is there. I think we should start looking at thinking outside the box and having a new paradigm. We need a paradigm shift in the way that we think. And I agree with this previous speakers that the region has seen more than its fair share of conflicts and wars and devastation, etc. The region is also facing enormous challenges because we are talking about a region where there is a lot of youth and the youth population is growing. We are also talking about a region where it's facing economic challenges because of the fall in the oil price and etc. and because of the overspending in arms. I think everybody is suffering. I think there is a war fatigue in Yemen. I think there is also conflict fatigue in the Gulf. And I think this is probably just as a good time as any time that maybe a more constructive dialogue that should take place. I think also, there are countries, as I can see, there are, both sides will be throwing mud at each other, but I think there are countries in the region that can actually help. I think Oman has been instrumental in the past in, as you mentioned, Barbara, in helping with this situation, and enjoys the trust of both sides. And perhaps that is somewhere where we can start by just having not even a formal dialogue, but informal dialogue, where we can at least start some kind of confidence building measures. We can start to see where everybody stands and then can move from there. I think everybody is ready for it. I think Iran is ready. It's been calling for this for a long time as well. And it's been receiving a deaf ear from our side in the Gulf. And I blame our side for it. I also blame Iran for some of its policies. But at the same time, we have to give them credit. They've been calling for a dialogue. And I think their call for a dialogue is not being met because there is a lot of mistrust. People here do not believe what Iran says. And they fear that there is, that Iran is still the same as it was in the early 80s and that it hasn't changed and it hasn't evolved. And we have to also understand that Iran has its own security threats and its own security perceptions, and Iran has to understand our security threats and fears and perception. And I think we need a dialogue that is outside the media and beyond the media, and maybe some kind of a back channel where these people can actually sit down and talk. And I think, I agree that maybe the Yemeni case is not the only one, and it should not be maybe the only thing on the agenda, but I think it should be one of the most important items on the agenda because the people in Yemen are suffering. And I think we've had enough, and I think we've all contributed to their misery. And I think also the Houthis are at fault, as well as other parties. So I hope that the Houthis would have learned a lesson from this, and hopefully that they will, they'll correct their mistakes. But they're also under pressure, and I think they're trying to say something. They're trying to send a message, perhaps, to the Saudis or to the Americans by doing this, which I think is a major mistake in my way of thinking. Thank you.
We are almost out of time, but I want to give Ilan one more chance to comment on questions. Some of the questions coming in have to do with arms sales. And of course, Iran has complained that while it's being told that it should give up on ballistic missiles and so on, that Arab states are still buying lots and lots of weapons. Ilan, I would assume that the Biden administration is going to review all of these major sales, and that if the US does not go through with some of them, that could actually be a confidence building measure in a way for regional de-escalation.
So let me actually, Barbara, I'll address that. First thing I want to do is just on the Houthi designation. I want to say something from the US side of how I perceive it, which is two reasons. First of all, you also have to look at it in the context of American politics. The Trump administration had 4 years to designate the Houthis. They did it in the last week. They did it for a reason, not before then, because it makes it impossible to execute any kind of a policy towards Yemen. which is why they waited so long and basically left the stinker for the Biden administration, who had to either quickly reverse it or would be stuck with it because of American politics for a potentially long time, because it's very hard to take off terror designations. So they just decided to flip the switch back. I think it was much more motivated by the idea of just the humanitarian assistance and everything that they were hearing from humanitarian assistance groups. Now, being clear-eyed about the fact that whenever you have humanitarian assistance in a conflict, the warring parties are going to sometimes siphon off pieces of it to, who they're most interested in supporting. But still, you have, the United Nations has called Yemen the greatest humanitarian emergency in the world right now. And cutting off an ability to even be able to provide that assistance to half the country is not something I think that the United States saw as an interest. I think it was first and foremost about that, not about like, this is a confidence building measures for the Houthis. I do think that they want to leave open the possibility to engage and actually have a negotiation that will have to inevitably include the Houthis. And the way US counterterrorism law works is once you have this designation, you can't do that. But it wasn't first and foremost about that. It was about the humanitarian piece. I don't think that they were surprised or were expecting the next day the Houthis to put down their weapons and not start sending missiles into Saudi Arabia. Like, I don't think they were under that illusion, So I just wanted to clarify that. And then on arms sales, look, I think they're going to go through and review the arms sales that all what happened at the very end. I don't think we can, this is definitely one that's going to take a while. And I don't think we can read into it one way or the other yet, where it's going to come out. And frankly, I think a lot of where it comes out will depend on the conversations the United States has with its Gulf partners and whether we can align ourselves on policy and address some of our mutual concerns. And if we can't, then I think there's a higher chance. So I think it'll be driven by a lot more than just like yes, no on this particular weapon system. But I do want to sort of emphasize on this, this is back to the exchange, especially between Hossein and Ebtesam on this issue, which, one, I do think we need to be clear-eyed that in many cases, Iran has been exporting all kinds of problematic weaponry across the region and pursued a lot of these steps that are problematic. So it's hard for everyone. But at the same time, we do need to find ways to de-escalate, understand that Iran, it's a security dilemma, and Iran has its own concerns. And when it sees lots of, high-end American weaponry coming into the region, being sold to US partners, it also causes Iran to buy more and, double down. So both of these things can be true at the same time. Like two suggestions I would have, and I think I mentioned one of them already, is before we even talk about Lebanon or Iraq or things like, can we start with like some of the other countries? Can we start, for example, with, Bahrain and, ceasing support for various, no weapons need to go into Bahrain and look, there are groups inside of Iran that are supported by, the UAE, that are supported by Saudi Arabia, that are supported by Israel. Nobody has to admit who these groups are, but can you at least both sides say, we're going to stop supporting as a first step towards non-interference. We stop supporting armed groups in each other's countries. Then let's go worry about all the other countries in the region where we still have to deal with this. And, everybody's got pretty good intelligence services. They can do some verification on this. It's hard, especially since nobody admits anything, but maybe we can make progress there. And similarly, on missiles and conventional weaponry, can we have a dialogue? Because, the US is definitely interested in Iran pulling back on its ballistic missile capabilities and its missiles across the region. Although, frankly, I have more concerns about the sort of shorter range, more accurate missiles than I do about. But every time you have this conversation with Iranians, it immediately, the response back is this is a regional security issue, not a nuclear issue. So let's have it in a regional security context. Let's have it in the context of conventional arms control in the region. And if both sides can take steps, Iran is going to pull back on these missiles. Some of the Gulf states might pull back on these arms systems. And we do it together. Maybe there you can make some progress. Because I would love to get to that world Hossein is talking about where the Gulf patrols itself, there's an agreement amongst all the countries. I just think that's going to take a very long time. And I think we need to start with very practical, actionable, small steps that can move us in that direction, or at least before we get there, just start reducing the conflict some before we kind of can get to a place like that, maybe years down the road.
All right, I'm afraid we're going to have to stop here. We're already over time. There have been a lot of good suggestions made, and I think we've also seen the extent of the issues that we have in front of us. But I can't think of a better group to talk about all of this. So I want to thank you all. I want to thank those who stuck with us and watched. I want to thank Yunus very much for convening this panel, and I hope we'll have some good news if we get together again in a couple of months, that some of these issues at least have been addressed. So